Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Joe. Here comes my co-host Stan.
Hello and greetings.
And today we're starting a new podcast where we're going to review TV shows and movies that are focused on, well, being history dramas, essentially. We decided to start with Pillars of the Earth because why not? At some point, we may end up doing a podcast on the book, which is a best-selling book for a reason. The story is one that I think a lot of people have become pretty familiar with by now, but it's interesting to see the similarities and differences between novel and show, as well as between actual history and show. The story starts off with the sinking of the White Ship, which was carrying William Atheling, or Guillaume Atheling, that is to say, Guillaume the Heir. And I say Guillaume because at this time, the English monarchy were more French than they were, well, English. Alors, le reste de la programme va falloir être en français. D'ici, on va discuter. I'm kidding. No. I'm not. We're not going to do it in French because this is an English channel, but still, it would be funny. Maybe at some point. The messenger arrives to warn the king, well, your son is dead, as well as a couple of your other kids, because several of Henry's illegitimate children also died, notably one of his favorite illegitimate daughters, who was, I think, a countess. So this was a very traumatic event for Henry I, and it's said that he never smiled again. I don't think it's that he never smiled, but I would not doubt that he stopped, that laughter died in his castle, as did joy. But in the show, his daughter is close at hand and is still a child. This was not so, historically. By now, she had been married and widowed, having been raised for most of this time in Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire, and been married to Emperor Heinrich, I think, the Fourth. And she was a very, very popular queen, well, empress, and very clever one. She learned her German quite well, quite quickly. We do know that. And she spoke Deutsch and Francais. That said, they probably should have hired a German actress to play her. The English actress who plays her character, though, is quite talented. She is quite good. The actress is quite good. The adult actress. So having the child there say, I will have a baby boy father, never fear. No. By this time, though, I can't remember whether she was on her way back or not, but she would soon afterwards marry Geoffroy d'Anjou, or Geoffroy Plantagenet. And Geoffroy was son of a very powerful count, or comte, but one could almost say he was a duke, because he was... Anjou was a powerful principality at this time. It was actually strong enough to contain Normandy even during the age of Guillaume le Conquérant, William the Conqueror, who conquered England. That guy was never able to properly trounce Anjou. So right there, you should know that Anjou was very powerful, very influential. And the Maud, or Matilda, arc of this show, well, at least of this episode, is not entirely accurate, with having her later pregnant and in England, because a good chunk of Henry's reign was to be spent kind of squabbling with his daughter, because she was 10 years older than her husband, and she hated her husband, and he hated her. So Henry had the unfortunate job of basically playing wedding counselor between his daughter and her handsome but fairly self-centered husband, who was also a renowned adulterer. Well, he was very unfaithful to his wife. And his wife, being a masterful woman, did not appreciate this. She was also probably a little smarter than her husband. So that didn't help matters either. So you have, but she on the other hand was too forceful and snobby and a little self-centered. So that doesn't help matters either. So this dynamic caused the royal court to be in a flux, so to speak. Henri eventually threatened to disown her because, well, she was getting so out of hand. Because by then she was now back with her husband because she had temporarily separated from him. Then she was forced to live with him again. But then she took her husband's side and said, hey, Dad, you promised a few castles as part of my dowry so that we could have easy access into Normandy. Why haven't you forked them over yet? Because the thing about the oath of the barons to serve her as and to recognize her as their queen was that it was supposed to come with certain, shall we say, leverage. They would get key castles that would allow easy access into Normandy so that they could easily force the barons into submission. This was the idea. And Matilda understood she needed these castles to, leverage things over the barons to make sure they would uphold their oaths. Henri did not like it because it also put him in a vulnerable position with her erstwhile untrustworthy husband. But the problem is that she basically said, trust is kind of a non-factor here as I have given birth essentially to 2 kids already. Like Henri and Guillaume, I think. So you've got her basically saying he already controls the heirs. Are you planning to cut my sons out of their inheritance? So you had this kind of father-daughter argument, which, yes, Geoffroy was arguing with Daddy because he wanted those castles. He was greedy for them. Well, he was greedy by nature. But it was almost more her and her dad. So it went from, an argument over her marriage to an argument between him and her. Eventually, he gave away some of the castles, not all. This still did not please her, but she was waylaid by her pregnancy. And, of course, you had the troubles of, Holly just did not trust her husband. And who could blame him? He also had problems with the French monarchy, the Capelle line, which really did not like this union of Anjou and Normandy because it turned the 2 most powerful factions in Francia into a superpower, which also had a kingdom behind it. So you had almost 3 principalities united under one figure in Henri II. So they really had good reason not to like this. So they were basically using their influence over Normandy and England to try to further the distrust and the gap. So overall, this was a geopolitical nightmare for a lot of people. The show does not really deal with that, which, fair enough. The show primarily deals with the peasants, which I absolutely love that. In the show, Etienne, or Stefan, we'll call him Etienne from here on out because that would be more historically accurate. But occasionally we'll switch back to Stephen, or Etienne Stefan, so you can understand who we mean. But Etienne and the church are conspiring to seize the crown. Now, historically, there's no proof that Etienne had the white ship burnt at sea. There's no proof that he started the calamity that was that party. But it is notable that he was supposed to be on board the ship, but that he suddenly said no and then found a different ship, a smaller one, and went on ahead to England. So it's highly possible, possibly even probable, that he did know there was going to be there was going to be a death or 3 or a dozen or 2 dozen on board that ship.
But the evidence is circumstantial.
Yes. So it's no sure thing. But it does his guilt even matter when the reality is the effects are more important than who did what or who did not do what. As to the show, they skip forward 18 years to 1138. By then, England was in the grips of a civil war called the Anarchy, as the show explains. But the show jumps forward to 1138. Who knows why? When it's supposed to be 1135. Very important key detail. Pryor James in this show is the one who raised Pryor Philip, which is different from the novel. In the novel, Pryor Philip was raised by someone else over in Wales, because he's Welsh. Yes, I know. How dare a Welshman ever command Englishmen, but that's the state of how desperate and badly England was doing at the time. They had to occasionally appoint Welsh clergymen in charge of English churches. Poor England, how she suffered so. I'm joking. Actually, Pryor Philip in the novel is a very lovable character. Same as in the show. But he was not raised by Pryor James. Pryor James was a neglectful prior who neglected his duties to his priory and all of its lesser cells simply because he felt bad and was crying himself to sleep every night over his involvement in the assassination of Prince William and of an innocent jongleur or minstrel from Prince Guillaume's court. So there are some massive differences. He's still crying himself to sleep in the show. It's just that he had nothing to do with Philip. It's a long story. It is a very long novel, actually. It's about 1,000 pages long. So, yeah. Helen, we find out her backstory. She's a lady who, helps out Tom. Now, Tom was trying to build a house for young William Hamley. William got rejected after he sexually harassed, almost assaulted, Aliana. Wow. And she fought back against him and then proceeded to humiliate him publicly, rightfully so, and which got an entire castle laughing at William. He races out, joins his mom and dad outside, and Tom gets sacked. But Tom says, "You do owe me a severance package," and this nearly ends up in his death. Now, he ended up having the balls to grab the horse of a Normand, which is, wow, these were the most violent people almost in history. So, at least in Western European history. So, that should tell you all you need to know about how courageous Tom Builder is. Probably one of the bravest characters I've ever seen in historical fiction. He's not a warrior, he's not a soldier, he just grabs the reins of one of the most bloodthirsty people's horses and just says, "You're going to pay me. Also, apologize for nearly running over my daughter. And I'm not backing down." Wow, this nearly results in him dying, but his wife screams out, "God will see the right of it and will punish you, my lord." At which point, William, who has definitely a phobia of a certain demonic place, we're not allowed to say what its actual name on YouTube. I get it. It is a cuss word.
A bad place.
Yes. And he's afraid of God, so he tells his buddy Wyatt, pay them. And Wyatt does. Then Tom ends up in the woods where Helen lives. She's a wild woman, an outcast, because, certain events that I'll get to in a minute. Martha's attacked, bandits escape, and they escape with Tom's pig, which he was going to kill and eat later. It was the times. And, it's actually normal to kill a pig and eat it. But Helen welcomes them into her cave, at which point she explains to Tom that she was a nun. In the book, it's explained she was a nobleman's daughter, but he eventually got annoyed with her and her crass behavior and decided to throw her into a monastery and basically disown her. And she did not want to be a nun, so she eventually found love with a jongleur, Jacques, or Jack's dad. Jacques was a jongleur who was framed for a crime, had his tongue cut out, and was burnt alive. Not a fun way to go. And just as the gravity of that punishment should strike everyone. The thing is, I know there's like that weird pop culture belief that burning people alive was like a Tuesday in the medieval period, but it actually wasn't. This was not a common punishment. And I know you'll say, oh, well, what about witchcraft? No, that was not till the 17th century. By then, you got to bear in mind, that's pre-modern. That's not medieval. Medieval people basically went, wow, whoa, bro, no, you don't do that. You don't burn someone alive. That's you can't do that unless it's in extreme circumstances. And I do mean extreme, because you got to bear in mind when Mary Tudor burnt about 200 people just outside of London, she was considered insane. And these punishments, I've actually read the primary sources. The people genuinely thought that this was, they had never seen a burning before. No one who crossed the road and traveled in and out of London on commercial business had ever seen a burning. Not even some of the 70 or 80-year-olds had seen a burning. And they thought that, well, it's been like centuries since we heard of a burning. And Jeanne d'Arc's death was uncommon. It was considered actually incredibly harsh and unusual that she should be burnt. And there were clergymen who did not feel comfortable with what happened. Because, they're like, we're burning someone alive for dressing up as a man. At least that's the public excuse. In reality, we're burning her for the glory of England, but that's going too far. So, Jacques le Jongleur being burnt alive would have been considered by the common people really weird and unusual. The typical punishment in medieval times was hangings. They were nice, clean, and instant. Because even medieval people had some ethics and thought, a bit of mercy. And even pre-modern people did. Now, the whole witch burning thing only became kind of popular later on during witch hunts, but even then it was very uncommon. And a lot of women who confessed had their sentences commuted to other forms of execution, which was far more merciful. But yeah, so that's where Helen, I don't think, mentions that her husband was burnt in the show, so that, if she had, she doesn't explain it just yet, because Tom would immediately go running because, what was your husband guilty of? It must have been something pretty extreme. Now, that would be his assumption at meeting a stranger. Once he gets to know Helen, he realizes she's a great lady. She's a great gal. But anyways, I'm just going over some of the history so that you guys can better understand the context of the show and whatnot. Now, Aang insists that they leave because she's a little nutty on religion. And she's apprehensive about this woman whom she fears is trying to take her husband from her. Which, kind of. Helen is angling to marry Tom, but it's implied she's not adverse to living as his mistress for a time. So essentially, it's not exactly that she's trying to take... She's basically not adverse to living in bigamy. She doesn't like it, but she's kind of... She likes Tom so much. She's willing to tolerate another woman. Aang, though, is not quite so accepting. I don't blame her, to an extent. So, it's very complicated. Aang, though, is pregnant and dies giving birth. And Tom decides to expose the child because they have no means of caring for the child. But after a few minutes, he decides, no, I can't. I have to go back for the baby. And races back to get his child back. Meanwhile, now this is a plot point the show does better to an extent, but the book does a better job explaining why Johnny Eightpence is called Eightpence. You see, he's mentally deficient, so to speak. He's actually not very smart. But Johnny Eightpence has such a generous, kind heart that everybody loves him in the book. And he basically co-parents Jonathan with Tom in both the book and in the show. And there's almost a beneath the surface, like beneath the narration, a bromance between Johnny and Tom, because they both put Jonathan first above all else in life, which it is a very touching thing. In the show, Johnny Eightpence is not portrayed as being mentally handicapped, but the writing with him is really good, I must admit. So that his nickname is just, I don't know why they call him Eightpence in the show. But he finds the child because he was the bandit and thinks it's a gift from God to him. So he decides to take in the child, which this sort of thing did occasionally happen historically, I suspect. But he decides to turn his life around by going into a monastery and becoming a monk. Brigands becoming monks was very common. Actually, this became a bit of a problem because people would break the law, then go to church and just say, I'm a monk for a week, and all I have to do is recite one Latin verse. Henri de Le Plantagenet, or Henry II, hated that. He wanted those guys not to be allowed to hide behind, that Latin verse, and said, okay, if you become a monk, you have to become a monk permanently. But if you broke the law, after becoming a monk, the church should kick you out and give you over to me, and I'll punish you. So that you get double punished. Because you shouldn't be breaking the law and killing people and violating women or young boys or something. But, Thomas Becket, that lunatic. And I do mean that lunatic. But anyway.
That narcissistic lunatic.
Yeah. But anyways, Aang dies. The king is poisoned, which historically, I kind of suspected, again, the only reason is Henri Le Premier was so healthy. Then he just killed over all of a sudden, and Etienne raced over to seize the treasury. Yeah. But Etienne then spent the rest of his reign trying to be a knight. Yeah, he was weak-willed and very nice, but his treatment of Henry II almost seemed like he felt guilty historically. Like, he always tried to... This is his political enemy, but he's like, I have to cozy up to him. I need to make sure the boy is well taken care of. I'll pay for everything he needs, and whatnot, to the point that Henry II thought he was a joke. But, yeah, there's something off there historically. But, hey, once again, it's possible, not certain. On the other hand, what is certain is that Henry I did assassinate his own brother for the throne. So, yeah. It was not exactly uncommon practice for Norman kings to kill each other, or princes to kill each other for the throne. The practice, to a large extent, stopped after the death of King John. Now, I say largely because Richard was not assassinated per se, but because John had nothing to do with that. As for Henry II, he was driven to his death by his own son Richard, not even John. Ensuite, John was driven to his death by his barons, so, it's the practice kind of survived but didn't. But then with Henry III, it stopped being common practice to, kill your king. Because, it's kind of disrespectful and it kind of leads to a lot of chaos and anarchy throughout a kingdom. I don't know. I'm just saying. Anyways, you've got Waleran and Philip who form a deal when the time comes to sway the monastical election of Kingsbridge, because Philip brings the news that the Earl of Shiring is planning to betray Etienne when Etienne becomes king. And this is something that Waleran is very, very concerned about. Waleran then decides to send the Hamleys in because, he does not want to get his own hands dirty because he's nervous about what might happen. But before that, he assassinates the original bishop of Kingsbridge to try to claim the bishopric. In the novel, he doesn't do that, but he does withhold the information of the death until, last minute. That said, Philip is shocked and horrified and suspects the truth. And we've got, in turn, Maud escaping to Anjou, and for some reason this distresses Etienne. I have no idea why. He should be rejoicing, because she's no longer a threat to him. Historically, what sent him panicking was the fact that she was arriving in England, because historically there was a very interesting tactic that Geoffroy and Matilda did. You see, her brother Robert, he thought about Robert de Gloucester. He thought about whether or not he should, break his oath to Etienne or fulfill his oath to Maud. And he waited till the situation was advantageous to himself. He was a little self-profiteering. The loyal brother was Raoul, or I think Ralph, of, I believe, Cornwall. He was loyal. He stuck to Mathilde from the word go. He was like, no, that's, it's for the family. Robert was the one what can I get out of it? Maybe I could rule through her, or later through her son. He was a very big political animal to an extent. But he was a smart man. He was a competent man. But the thing is, historically, Matilda would slip into England and rule the western half of England. The middle was no man's land, and the east was kind of Etienne's. As for Normandy, her husband was given free rein to go conquer it. And the thing is, he was conquering it in the name of their son. So basically, husband and wife decided to divide and conquer. For Geoffroy, this also freed him up from his marriage so that he could, have fun. But he did remain firmly fixed to his mission, which was to claim his son's inheritance. Now, at this time, England was a backwater, but it came with one important thing: a crown. That was the only thing that mattered when it came to England, for the most part. It did have some resources when properly managed, like under Henri le Premier, but Normandy was the main breadbasket, was the main thing everybody wanted. Because England comes with the problem of Scotland and having to fend off the constant attacks from there, which did get annoying. But this time, David was king, David, and David, or Saint David, was a very pious, very holy king, but he was a juggernaut. And he ruled a good chunk of Northumbria, that is to say the north of England, and Scotland. And the thing is, he was the right-hand man of Henry, till Henry died. Then he decided to take what he could for himself. But he played one monarch against the other, but generally, for the most part, remained loyal to his niece. But Matilda was keen to also secure his loyalties and to keep him from raiding into England, because he was not just raiding, he was grabbing territory and land and forcing people to pay homage to him and then her. And the thing is, he kind of reversed the situation later between England and Scotland, because previously, in 920, I believe, or thereabouts, Athelstan forced Constantine II to pay homage to the English king. Then this was repeated in 934. Then in 937, you had the Great Battle of Brunanburh. And after that, it stopped. Scotland was no longer an appanage of England. But then you had Malcolm III, who naturally was a firm English vassal until, the conquest. And Malcolm was more English than he was Scottish. Or Celtic, I should say. But David was to force, essentially, Henry II to pay homage to him before Henry II took the throne. But then David was succeeded by the worsting Scottish monarchs in, I think, almost history. They ended up immediately becoming English vassals for Scotland. Scottish territory, but then Alexander II kind of fixed that problem because Alex saw that as no. So the entire situation with England was a very complex situation. You had David, who was keen to grab what he could and to make England his vassal, which he succeeded for a time. To an extent. As for England, Etienne was pushed out of Normandy after a while. Now, he did end up securing a part of it, but Geoffroy was kind of saying, dibs, for my son, I mean, but it really also for me. So, you've got husband and wife that did divide and conquer. She's going to go secure her brother's aid and stiffen her brother Robert's spine and shore up support in England, while Geoffroy would force them to choose their Norman holdings or their English holdings. A lot of barons initially chose Etienne, but then when they realized they were being hit in Normandy, basically in the pocketbook, they said, sorry, Etienne, I like you. You're a real chill, nice guy, but, nice guys finish last.
I can't feed my people,
Well, I like having both my territories in Normandy and England, so tough cookies, I'm dropping you like a bad habit. Etienne lost all of his lands in Normandy, sadly for him, over the course of this war. Actually, early in the war, but to an extent. Normandy sunk into civil strife and war, and of course you had the French monarch who, was happy to push things into further chaos because, opportunity! And just to make things even more confusing, one French monarch soon died, Robert II, for Henri le Premier de France. So we have a Henri le Premier who just died in England, and we have a Henri le Premier en France. And on top of that, we have Henri le Deuxième, who is technically supposed to be the legitimate king of England right now. Wow. Just
lots of Henrys.
Yep.
I bet you it made things a little confusing since they all spoke French.
At the time, apparently people did not get confused at all. Kudos to medieval people. A lot of people today, for some reason, think medieval people were dumb. When people back then were really smart. Yeah, sure, most were illiterate, but they were not dumb. They were very smart, and they actually had very well-trained memories and could remember entire tales and epics and mythology far better than people today could. I mean, no offense to people today. It's just people back then were pretty darn sharp for the most part. Though a lot of them did not know their history, others eventually did learn their history over the course of centuries. It was complicated. Anyways, this first episode of Pillars of the Earth, let's rate it. I'm going to actually rate it a 3. Historically, it's not entirely accurate, but it's so darn entertaining.
A 3. Lots happens, and you do see the establishment of a good long-term story.
You see the villains and you see the heroes. My only beef is that Etienne historically is a really nice guy. No, historically he was apparently a pretty nice guy. He was just spineless. And it was his wife's stiffening his spine. If he did participate in those 2 assassinations, possible assassinations I should say, I'd argue it was his wife pushing him into it.
I was just thinking that.
Because she was a iron lady. She was more a lady like Thatcher, to an extent, in terms of mood and temperament and ruthlessness. But the thing is, Etienne, though, deep down was a good man. And he repented of a lot, and sadly for him, although his eldest son was not a good man, he eventually buried his own son, whom he dearly loved. He was a guy who loved deeply, and he lost everything.
And that's very sad.
And he also suffered constant humiliations in his last few years. So he went to his grave, essentially a broken man.
It wasn't an easy time for the crown.
No, it's not an easy time for anyone. Matilda, for a time, was a broken woman when she went back to Normandy towards the end of the wars, because she had triumphed for a time, then caused her own failures, and then this broke her. And then the loss of Robert did kind of break her spine, so to speak. She went back to France, notably Normandy, and was to spend the rest of her days essentially as a nun, but she was often essentially co-ruler with her son, basically from a monastery managing the foreign affairs of her son's kingdom or federation of lands and territories, and so she was to receive embassies from the papacy for her advice on papal affairs, on how with Henry, like put in a good word for us. But like I said, popes sought her advice on their own affairs because she was that smart. French kings sought her favor and her counsel, both internally and with her son. You had other dukes and barons who did. You had the Holy Roman Emperor who did. You had German princes who did. Scottish princes. So that she just became, in some ways, the most important person in, I guess you could say, the English mini-empire, or the Angevin Empire. In some ways, more important than Henry himself. Because oftentimes, if people couldn't track him, they just sent word to her, and she'd forward the message to him, because she knew exactly where he was at all times. And she, for a time, did not spend any time with her son for a few of his formative years, because she was too busy fighting. Well, he did know her in his childhood, but then in his adolescence, he didn't really get to see her for the most part, because, she was fighting for his crown. But we know for a fact he was a mama's boy, and that when the time came, he apparently developed a very close relationship with her. Closer to her, to an extent, it seems, from what I can see, than Daddy, because he often consulted her on all things, although he sometimes ignored her advice, such as when she said, don't appoint Thomas Becket Archbishop of Canterbury. He did. He shouldn't have. But she was his favorite advisor, and apparently this caused some trouble with Eleanor of Aquitaine, because she was like, I'm your wife. Can I actually have a say? You have Henry. Laughs. No. My mom's boss here. Mummy doesn't think you should have a word.
Mummy is one of the most powerful people in Europe.
And the thing is, Eleanor was strong-willed, and actually I do think she could give good advice to her husband. He should have listened to her a bit more. He would have avoided a lot of civil wars. But the thing is, Henry did not want to listen to her. Instead, he preferred to listen to Mummy. But the other thing was, Matilda did not want to give over the position of matriarch to her daughter-in-law. Her daughter-in-law probably felt a little I went from Queen of France to basically just being shoved into,
the bedroom
and told, stay in the kitchen. Don't come out, because you have a stronger-willed, more influential woman around. And sadly, for Eleanor, she would hunger for this kind of influence and to be able to help her family. Now, she did help destroy her family for a time, because why not? But then later, she wanted to rebuild the family and, have the kind of influence and whatnot that she had seen her mother-in-law exert, but it would not be till John's reign that she would exert this kind of influence. Because ironically, Richard had no respect for her or care for her, whereas she was obsessed with Richard. But John was a mummy's boy as well. John was just a carbon copy of his dad in personality. So, yeah. So you have, for the most part, except John was a little crueler than Henry. A little. Henry could be pretty cruel at times. But that's why his mom was so important and she died in 1167, which is when Henry's golden age, for the golden age of his reign, for the most part, ended. That's just some of the history. I just felt that this gives context to this TV series. So hopefully in the future, we'll probably supply more information on cathedrals and that stuff, rather than some of the larger picture stuff. And hope this gave you a good idea and a good feel for what this podcast is going to be like. Hopefully we'll do more talking of the show than of the history. I'm sorry for all that.
It might end up later on that we talk more about the show, because we're building the setting.
Yeah. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button